welcome back to the Thrive Co-Living podcast here on YouTube. I'm pleased to introduce you to Mark Eddy. He has a drug testing franchise in the Louisville, Kentucky area. I'll let him tell a little more about it. And we wanted to do this business topic, and you noticed that we're doing all sorts of new topics, not just about topics surrounding Thrive, but other topics of interest, passions that people have, business expertise that they have to share, some talking about the mission of Thrive. But this is a business topic. And we feel like there's a lot of interest in, and should be, in drug testing, especially as people are going back into the workforce physically. So happy to have Mark here to talk about the subject as it relates to business. So thanks for being here, Mark.
Happy to be here. Thanks.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about the business in general, and then we'll focus on different drug tests. And I think one of my main interests is to find out what are the exposures to business owners if they don't do drug testing. What are the most common lawsuits and insurance claims and things like that really harm business owners, to educate all of us to know when we should use it and what the risks are if we don't. But just start anywhere that you like, maybe a little bit about what drew you to the field and and your business.
Well, I've had a very varied background, so I don't have any medical background. People kind of think that, oh, were you, in the medical field? I got this through a franchise consultant in the area. Prior to this, I owned a Potbelly sandwich shop franchise, which is a restaurant. Prior to that, I was an options trader on and off the floor. So it's been kind of varied. I really got into this because it met all my requirements in terms of monetary and what I wanted to do, and ease of running it with few employees. So we're a franchise. There's many there's over 50 in the U.S. Home office is based out of San Antonio. We do drug, alcohol, and DNA testing. So the drug testing can be varied from individuals up to companies and helping them maintain their policy, which is what we'll probably focus on today. Because through the pandemic, obviously people weren't hiring. So we kind of lost that pre-employment aspect, which is most of our business typically, is where people do their hiring and do their pre-employment drug testing. So
go ahead and give us the name of the company.
It's Fastest Labs, FASTEST. So the name is Fastest Labs basically because we want to, in addition to giving a higher level of customer satisfaction, we see people really fast. We report results really fast, get people in and out, as opposed to a lot of other places where they're not just doing drug testing. Typically you're at a medical facility where there's other things going on. Here we focus on the drug testing and the DNA testing. So we usually don't have anyone in our facility for even more than 10 or 15 minutes. So in terms of drug testing in the workplace, in addition to the pre-employment, a lot of companies need to have a policy where they're doing post-accident or random. Or reasonable suspicion, they call it, where someone looks like they might be under the influence, and you want to come in and do that test to make sure you're operating a safe environment. And that's what it's really all about. Obviously you have the main aspects of drug testing in order to prevent, certain people on drugs tend to be less efficient. They tend to steal to support their habit, but there's also healthcare costs involved as well. So, there's workman comp's claim require a drug test after an accident. OSHA requires some level of policy management and things like that. So it's really about just operating a safe work environment for everyone involved.
So what are the risks, and maybe talk about the top 3 or 4 that you're hearing about, because I bet there are some businesses that don't do drug testing and then they have an incident and then it gets their attention and they start doing it.
For sure. So I have big manufacturers as clients. I also have small concerns such as like commercial cleaning businesses or personal cleaning businesses. So an example there might be when people are in someone's residence and something goes missing, that's a problem. There could be litigation. What I like to emphasize with them as well is have a policy in place and be fair. If you've got several employees in a place and in a residence and something goes missing, if you're testing one as opposed to another, that could be unequitable, and litigation can come back from the employee. Now that's kind of minor, but still, if you're running a small business, that's a concern. Other than that, I mean, obviously, if someone is injured or there's a death and it's a result of someone that has been using, some type of illicit drug, then obviously the litigation potential there is just mammoth. So that's why, they require after accidents and things like that, a lot of places require an alcohol test as well. So that's basically a breath alcohol. So we can do, several different alcohol tests. One is a BAT. It's basically like when you're at a DUI, you're blowing into an instrument that's measuring your breath alcohol. We can also do a lab test or a rapid test for ETG. So ETG is the metabolite left behind after alcohol consumption. So that is not showing current impairment, but it is showing a use of the drug. So that's more in a situation of a rehabilitation type situation where someone needs to prove that they're not consuming alcohol. An interesting topic that I really have been doing a lot of research on lately is marijuana and where that's going. But that's the next subject. I mean, obviously, just the litigation involved in accidents or deaths and things like that is where you're really going to find that.
On alcohol, do companies do pre-employment testing, typically searching for alcohol?
Some do. So I have one company that and that's the thing too, is that you wouldn't think that someone's going to be, having a couple beers before they go and do their interview, but it's really just showing because someone who, needs that to get through an interview can have some type of a problem. I do have one company, it's in their policy. They do a breath alcohol and a 10-panel drug test for every pre-employment hire. So not everyone does it, but that's mostly in terms of post-accident or reasonable suspicion. I had one instance where a local manufacturer here, it was during the pandemic and the guy wasn't wearing his mask, and then he went out to his car for lunch and then came back and all of a sudden he's wearing a mask and they're noticing certain behaviors. So they came over and I think he blew the second highest I've had, which was like a 0.15. So 0.08 is legally drunk. So he'd obviously been consuming something. So, that alcohol is really more for, current impairment, which is fascinating to me because the whole marijuana debate is the problem with current marijuana testing is you're testing for the metabolite. So a lot of drugs you're testing for the metabolite stays in the body for 2 to 5 days. So that can show if you're looking for methamphetamines, cocaine, those type of drugs. Obviously, if someone's done that within 2 or 3 days, there's some type of bit of a problem. Marijuana can stay in the bloodstream 2 to 30 days typically. So a lot of companies I talk to, and there's a discussion on, do you really care if one of your employees got high 3 weeks ago? And is that going to cause them to not perform at their position 3 weeks later? And it's very similar to how I think going forward, marijuana is going to be treated, or I believe should be treated like alcohol, where you want to try to measure current impairment, because that's what you do with alcohol. With breath alcohol, I don't know if you have an employee and if you tested him and he came back and said that he had, they can't say this, but 2-3 glasses of wine the Saturday before, you don't really care. That's his time. So why is it different that marijuana should be like that? I believe the problem is, and hopefully it's coming down the pipe, is that a way to measure current amount of the actual drug in the system at that time that shows impairment, which is how you measure alcohol.
Back to alcohol for a second, and the marijuana issue really does intrigue me.
Yeah.
Just because it's if it's not already in your state, medically, it's going to be there, at least medically.
Yes.
I think within the next couple of years. I want to say there's like 36 states that have some form of of
Something like that.
marijuana legalization. But anyway, so let's say somebody does has a drink or two most evenings with dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if an employer is not looking at it from a current impairment situation, like post accident, if they're looking at it, would might they show might it show up as a certain level of concentration and eliminate the possibility of somebody being hired
It might
over
very
something like
well.
that?
It might very well. The amount to consume 0.08 to get there, someone like you or I would have to consume several drinks over the course of an hour to get there. So typically the liver is going to be able to metabolize that overnight. So in order for someone to blow a 0.08, which is legally drunk, they would have to have many drinks and stop, very early before they came to the interview. So the thing with the breath alcohol is that it shows current impairment because it's showing alcohol in your bloodstream at the moment. If you have 2 glasses of wine, let's say, you go out, you have a bourbon and 2 glasses of wine with a steak dinner, and then you come to work and you go to bed at midnight, you wake up at 7 and go to work. That's not going to be enough to show. I mean, it could show some it depends on body weight, metabolism, kind of like marijuana does, but it's not going to show anywhere near a 0.08.
And that's
So
what you're testing. That's the level that you're testing for. You're not testing for concentrations that occur over a period of time. You're checking for current use or recent use.
with the
Okay.
breath alcohol machine, you're looking for alcohol in the system at that present time. And 0.08 is the level that's been determined that is impairment level. So I
So
talked about the
the blood tests are not typically testing for concentrations, long-term concentrations of alcohol or
the,
long-term consumption of alcohol.
the breath alcohol is testing for blood alcohol, actual alcohol in the system at that time.
Okay.
So through the breath, it's coming from the lungs. So it's the concentration of alcohol that's in the blood at that time. The other test that I'm talking about, this ETG, the metabolite, that's just after the liver breaks it down. So that's not going to show current impairment. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's go back to marijuana for a second because um, and you're see what you're reading in the tea leaves. There are certain activities that somebody could perform um, even under the influence of alcohol. So do you see or do you foresee that it will depend on what the activity is? Obviously, if they're working from heights or they're using heavy equipment, that's obvious. But let's just say, oh, I won't even come up with a situation. But there are some situations that are not dangerous. Um, I want to say, somebody that's sitting with an older person, but I guess you wouldn't want somebody that's high hanging out with older people anyway, but
For sure.
some sort of
So,
sitter.
yeah, I mean, marijuana is something that I can pull off the panel if need be. And I've had several companies that talk about it. And if you're let's say a marketing or an advertising company and your creatives might use it to some extent, it depends on what your policy is. The issue is with like DOT testing, that's on a federal level, that's regulated. And those are people that are operating heavy machinery, they're operating at heights, they're operating trucks, they're working with FAA with or the railroads and things like that. So that, to measure that. So I really feel like it's going to come down. And I mean, let's be honest, I really feel that there's a lot of parallels between marijuana and alcohol because you take 3 different people, consume the same amount of alcohol, and depending on their weight, age, metabolism, one might not look drunk at all, and one might be extremely impaired. And I think marijuana is very similar to that, where 3 different people, depending on how much their tolerance is and how they react to the substance, can react in very different ways. Just like there's the happy drunk and the angry drunk and things like that. So I really feel there's just a bunch of parallels. And with marijuana, yeah, you're right. If you have someone that's sitting behind a desk and proofreading or coming up with creative thoughts, does marijuana really, is that a source of concern? And is, there an addiction issue with marijuana? Some would say that alcohol is actually more damaging and more addictive to the body than marijuana is. I mean, there is some research that says that. So that's why I kind of feel that I really feel the breakthrough is going to be when there is some type of machine that's useful, that's efficient, that's accurate, and fairly portable to be able to measure some type of level impairment or level in the drug of marijuana in the system. That's where I think things will turn.
Do you think it, have you heard, are policies different in states where it's legal recreationally,
Yes,
legal
most definitely.
medically? And
So
and let's
we
say
have
you have a medical prescription card to have it, there's some conflict right there, you know.
so that's precisely like so the example I use a lot is Adderall. I have a rapid test in-house that if you're on Adderall at a prescription level, at a reasonable level, you will flag and it will just say amphetamines. It's a binary thing, it's a yes or no. So when I take a rapid, it just says amphetamines. It doesn't say, hey, this is a prescription drug, or hey, this guy bought it off the street. That's where our rapid, we go to that extra level and we send it off to the lab where it's tested and confirmed. It goes in front of an actual doctor who looks at the results and says, yeah, that's Adderall. They call the donor. The donor provides a prescription. That test will come back from the lab negative, even though it flagged as we call presumptive positive, or it flagged in my office. So, the same thing is with, people on other type of prescription drugs that can flag as benzos. There's some over the counters that can flag as methamphetamine, pseudoephedrine, if taken in enough quantity, or opiates or things like that. So, in terms of, so that's also with, we talk about the medical marijuana card, because that's going to be kind of a prescription. So we have, I believe there's 2 franchisees in Colorado in the Denver area. And they've had several people, as long as they're not federally regulated, they just take marijuana off the panel because, and as long as it's not a safety sensitive type situation, and as long as they're consistent in their policy again, then it's fine. They take it off the panel. And I've talked to several people here, and most want to leave it on the panel because it is illegal on a federal level. And then when it does come back, they really offer more of a listen, we'll hire you on, and this is the protocol we're going to go through. As long as you're consistent with that, we're going to give you a random test within the next month, whatever their case is. I don't know the details of what people do, but there are companies that are pulling it off their panel, and as long as they're not federally regulated, we'll be fine. And it's in their policy.
Or you call them donors, that are the people being tested, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are they routinely asked, let's say pre-employment testing, are they routinely asked, are there any prescription drugs that you're on that you'd like to disclose? Like Adderall or.
Some companies do that. Some companies will send them in here for a rapid, and as long as they have a prescription for Adderall, that's fine. The danger there is when someone has a prescription and they might be abusing that prescription. So they can show the head of HR, yeah, I've got a prescription for Adderall, and that person in HR is not going to know if this person is actually abusing that or using it the way they should. When we send it to the lab for confirmation and it goes in front of that doctor, sometimes, even if they have a prescription, it'll come back as a positive drug test because the doctor says, well, the levels that are present in the substance in the urine of the donor are way above what this prescription is called for. So even if someone has a prescription, it could be abusing it, or it might be someone else's prescription. So that's why we recommend sending it off to the lab. Some companies, if they do know, or someone comes forward and says, I do have a prescription, they'll just skip the rapid because they know it's probably going to flag, and they'll go right to the lab test. And the upside to that is, like I said, it's going in front of an actual doctor. It's in a lab. The downside is it's more time. With a rapid, people walk out with results. With a lab test, it's usually 2 to 3 business days, which is still pretty fast.
I would imagine that some of this is HIPAA related, asking people to give their health information is probably illegal.
Well, in terms of if it's in their policy, And if it's in terms of a drug that's in their policy that they can't use, because I mean, let's be honest, alcohol is legal, but if you're at your job inebriated, and that's going to impair you for their job, and it's in the policy, that's something where it's considered when you're breaching that safety type of issue, where and it's there's leeway there, and it's also people are it's in the employee handbook. The employee is signing off. Every person that comes in here, they sign a consent to be tested before we test them. They don't have to test, but so for DOT, we follow those guidelines a lot because they're very rigid. If A, then B. If B, then C. Whereas with companies, they can go if A, then D. There's some leeway there. So with DOT, if they refuse to test, that can be considered. If it's a refusal to test, that could be considered, grounds for termination. And as long as it's in the policy that somebody signs off with, that's fine.
So you mentioned, and I'm learning a lot here, and I confess I know very little, if anything, about the subject.
I've learned a lot myself in the past couple of years. I've got to be honest about the world that I'm in.
Sure. You mentioned a rapid test as opposed to a blood test. Talk about
a lab test.
A lab test.
We actually here at Fastest Labs, we don't do any blood draw. We're all minimally invasive. So the most invasive we're going to get is the DNA testing requires a cheek swab, or with the saliva, it's a cheek swab. Other than that, it's fingernails, hair, urine, and saliva. We don't do any blood draws. So the difference is there's a rapid and then there's a lab-based test. So the lab-based test, it's going to an actual lab. It's going in front of a doctor. I'm not a doctor. But with our rapid system, we have a partnership with a company called Smart Screens, where we've got a tablet and there's special cups, and the tablet comes up and that'll read the cup and helps us with user error in terms of, it's typical, you see the line, there's a control line, and then there's another line that if the line's not there, then it's positive or presumptive positive. So the positives to a rapid are it's immediate, and a negative test is a good negative. With the rapid, a presumptive positive, because if someone is, and in all honesty, I thought it was, full of malarkey, but poppy seeds actually can come back and cause an opiate positive drug test in a rapid. And it's not necessarily because the poppy seed itself, but typically if the poppy seeds are not washed, the area they're in has a lot of residue because of the plants that are processing the poppies. So I've actually heard that has happened as well. So, it's really, you're just trying to protect the donor and their privacy and things like that. So we're completely non-invasive. But the rapid test, the negative is a good negative. They walk out with a negative, and then positive, it just depends on what the company wants to do. They want to accept the prescription that the company has. We don't have to send it on. Most, in order to, they follow the same guidelines as long as they're consistent. They always send it off, or they never send it off.
So let's say a donor gets a positive in an area that the employer doesn't want. Can they request a blood test? And you're saying a negative is dependable, but a positive may not be?
So we call it a non-negative or a presumptive positive. The reason why we're saying that is because like I said, if someone's on Adderall, it's going to say amphetamines, but it's really not amphetamines. It's an actual prescription that they have. If it's something that they have a prescription for, then it's really a negative test because they have a valid reason and they're using that prescription the way they should. So it's really, even though the drug is in their system, it's not an illegal drug because they have a prescription. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm. What are the drugs that are typically tested for in the rapid and then with the blood test?
So we can test up to 18 substances, including ETG, as a rapid. So like I said, I've got several people that come to me on a random or a weekly basis because for their court, they need to show that they're not consuming any alcohol whatsoever. So we have an ETG rapid, which, like I said, is the metabolite left behind after the liver breaks down the actual alcohol. Other than that, we can rapid test up to 18. I believe we've got a new cup coming out that tests up to 22. Your main ones are going to be your basic 5-panel, which is marijuana or THC, opiates, amphetamines, that type of stuff. Then you get your 10-panel, which expands out, and that's going to include your, so some 5-panels actually have methamphetamines. They combine amphetamines and methamphetamines into one. So, but your 10-panel is going to expand out. It's going to have methadone. It's going to have methamphetamines, benzodiazepine, which is your Xanax, buprenorphine. Some have oxycodone, things like that. So typically, once you get outside the typical 5 or 10-panel, you're really testing a more drilled down version of the drug. So you're looking for, rather than looking for opiates, you're looking for morphine or something like that. Okay. So with the rapids, we can test up many things. Typical in the Louisville area is your 10-panel. Your DOT is an expanded 5-panel. And with the lab test where we send it off, I've got labs that'll test almost any kratom, anything that you want to test for. I've tested for crazy things. I've also got a lab that will take, test for unknown substances. If someone thinks someone's poisoning their food, but they don't know what it is, they'll test and find out what's in that substance. Test for metals and things like that. So there's a lot of different things that you can test for. But even with a rapid, I can test for a lot of different substances.
May I assume that the more things you're testing for, the more expensive the test is for the employer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
you've talked about or hinted at some crazy things. What's the craziest thing that you've encountered so far in the drug testing?
The DNA testing, you get kind of Jerry Springer-ish. I got to be honest about that. But typically, once people get in here, they respect that we're just trying to do a job. I have tested for it's a substance that's found in cough medicine, and I'm blanking. I think MHB. It's something like that. I have tested. There was someone who came in here. And they were basically stealing from Walgreens and CVS's. They were stealing all this cough medicine because of the product that was in here, and we have a lab test that can test for that. So that's probably the craziest thing that I've tested for. I have tested for kratom before.
For what?
Fentanyl is a big one, and I actually had an interesting situation lately where people that were being tested for, I don't know if there's the court system or for to have their possession of their kids, but they were being tested in another facility, and it was coming back positive for fentanyl. And this person was like, "I've never done fentanyl. There's no way." So they came here. We did a lab test, and it came back fentanyl. And they said, "There's no way." And what really is happening is it's in your system. It's there. So the crazy thing about fentanyl is it's very easy to overdose. It's a high level tranquilizer, and it's inexpensive. So I think a lot of people on the street are cutting other more expensive drugs with fentanyl to kind of more bang for your buck thing. So, I can't speculate, but I think that this person was consuming something that wasn't on their test and was unknowingly ingesting fentanyl, which is scary because I don't know if you've done any research on fentanyl, but it's a scary, addictive, and big problematic drug.
I think it's the one that's been deadly a fair amount.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people are moving to that too. I mean, you can tell the drug addictions as people move to a more inexpensive drug. A lot of people that were having oxycodone and those type of problems have actually moved back to heroin because heroin's less expensive. So, there was heroin problems, 30, 40 years ago, and then it moved into the prescription. And now as the prescriptions get more difficult to get a hold of and more expensive, people are going back into the less expensive drugs, and heroin's one of them, fentanyl's another. So, it is kind of scary because you don't really know how much you're ingesting. I mean, with heroin, it depends on the grade that you're ingesting. So very easy to overdose.
I gather that when an incident happens in the workplace, that the employer wants you there pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And you've said off camera that you have been to all parts of the state. You work in Kentucky.
Right.
And um, are people still obviously, I'll use the informal term, loaded when you get there? Have people presented in odd ways? And
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. And my record was a place I went about. Now this realized that I get a call and I have to get to my office to get my stuff and then get out there. So this one was at a place where this person was obviously inebriated, but they blew a .177 2.5 hours after I was called. Okay? So think about the amount of, they were still metabolizing. In one instance, the first recognition, I believe, it was at another place where the first recognition was like early, late afternoon, and it got progressively worse. So I don't know if the person was surviving, but I mean, I didn't do the test until, you know, 9 o'clock, and they still blew over a .08. So I was talking to the guy. I'm like, well, they're loaded now. Think about when you first observed the activity, because as the time goes on, obviously the liver is breaking down the alcohol. So yes, so I would say 90% of the time, people are very conducive to what I do. They understand it. They are doing it, and they've got a good job. I mean, some of these DOT driving jobs, they're good paying jobs. They like their jobs, and they understand that it's part of the process. So it's just easy to go through, and there's a .0 that they go, and then I do the test and send it off, and they're perfectly fine. The annoyance is just the fact that it takes sometimes 2 days for the results to come back. And if they've been involved in an accident, typically their policy is that they cannot be back behind the forklift or behind the wheel or whatever the case may be. But
period.
people are very conducive to what I do.
They can't go back on that equipment at all, ever?
So DOT, no, not ever, but they have to wait for a negative drug test. So DOT, basically, if there's certain instances, and it's spelled out, and that's kind of beyond my scope of what I do. But once they have the incident, they're pulled off, and until that test comes back negative, they can't operate safety sensitive machinery. If the test does come back with a substance, there's a whole area that they go through in terms of rehabilitation. There's a program. They have to go with a certain substance abuse counselor. They have to meet with them X amount of times. They have to agree to random testings, which can be observed. So I have to actually observe the collection. I have to be in there with the person. And most people, because like I said, some of these DOT jobs are really good, are, I had a problem, and they deal with it, and they accept the responsibility of the fact that they have to do these tests. So they're and they're used to it too. So they know the whole routine, easier for me because I really don't have to explain the whole process to people and guide them through it. They're kind of like, yeah, I've done this.
Do you feel like most employers that are at risk, because you're out in the community, you network a lot with businesses, do you think that we're at a point now where most employers who are at risk do have some sort of drug testing program? Or what percentage would you say?
I
I know
don't know
you
about
can't
a
know.
percentage. I do know that I have talked to a company in an industry that they should be drug testing. And I went, I made a call, and they were like, yeah, come on in. And I was like, well, do you have a policy in place? And the answer to me was, yeah, we had one, but that guy quit like 9 months ago. I really don't know what we do. So this is in an industry where there should have been randoms, pre-employment, and things like that. So and then I'm calling, and then they ghosted me. So I don't know a percentage. I do know there's companies out there that are not doing what they should be doing. And that's another thing too, is that as far as workers' comp, that's a problem. And if you're subject to OSHA requirements, you're supposed to have a drug test within 4 hours of an incident, or at least try to. You need to make an attempt to get someone in to do a drug test. And you're talking fines up, $8,000-$10,000. You're talking about thousands of dollars of fines if companies find out. I really think the pandemic has caused perhaps a laxing of this requirement, or the fact that it's tough to regulate. My opinion is there's a lot of companies out there that don't test that do. I'll be honest, there's a lot of companies that I wouldn't think drug tests that have a policy. like I said, some of these, these marketing type companies, marketing advertising that have creatives. I talk and typically what has happened is that the person in charge has had some type of exposure in the past to a workplace where there was drug use and saw the poor effects that it has in terms of theft and in terms of, the efficiency. And then they're just kind of like, well, I really don't care about marijuana. So I just, I don't test for marijuana. But I mean, it makes sense that, you might not care if someone has marijuana problem, but if there's a methamphetamine issue in your workplace, that's, I mean, I feel, and that's people's opinion, but I feel that that's kind of a different level of a ballgame. So, I mean, in general, I think most companies are trying to do the right thing. I also think that the pandemic has kind of put a wrench in some things because some companies have cost controls and other companies are just so crazy busy that it's one of those things that falls through the crack. What I've learned is that drug testing is kind of like insurance. It's one of those things where it's not a need until, oh boy, I've got a problem. It's a need. And so we have to quickly turn around and help out people relatively quick. So, I mean, that's one thing that we can do and we're pretty good at. But I deal with a lot. Most of the people that I'm dealing with as well are in an HR position. If it's a safety director or director of HR, unless it's an owner of a company. And from what I've learned, HR people they wear so many different hats that the fire that's going on at that current time is the most important fire. So they're dealing with that. So drug testing does get kind of to the back burner. And then, oh boy, we have to drug test. I get companies. So to work on a government site, sometimes in the state of Kentucky, they require a drug card. So I get, laborers in here, painters, masonry workers that are like, yeah, we've got a job at LG&E and I need a drug test by tomorrow. Sure, send them in and we give them drug cards and things like that. So it's a lot of stuff is, spur of the moment type things if a company doesn't have an ongoing policy.
With COVID, do you think that part of this laxness would be that many employers, I would think, have less engagement with their employees? That they're not coming in. Maybe if it's a trucking company, they're not coming into to spaces where they used to be hanging out.
Most definitely. That's a tremendous point too. Also with addiction services, a lot of these addiction clinics have kind of had to shut down. And from what I've interacted with counselors is that a Zoom call is going to hide a lot of behaviors that might be present in someone who's got an issue and has a problem that needs resolving. So that can kind of carry over into the workplace where if you've got, they're probably being a little lax too, because they're not noticing a reasonable suspicion. They don't notice the bottle of vodka that I have out of frame or the shit. Yeah. I mean, you're out of frame. That is a downfall of the pandemic. And I would say that's one of many different factors for sure. And I think just time and other, you're trying to keep your business afloat during a very interesting and unusual time. So, this might not be the most concerning factor at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of different reasons. But
and then with the stresses for some people of the pandemic, they're at a higher stress level. So I would imagine, I haven't seen stats on it, but I would imagine that drug and alcohol issues have increased significantly during this period.
For sure. And like you said, they're easier to hide. I mean, if I'm working, if I'm working, 20 feet from my liquor cabinet, it's easy to go over there at 2:00 and grab a drink without anyone really knowing, right? Whereas when you're in the workplace, you're right. So I think it is, there's a lot of different factors mentally that are contributing to use and abuse in the workplace, or even the workplace is your home, is your office at home.
Mm-hmm. So let's say you're meeting with an employer who is not drug testing and hasn't been consistent with it. Are there any things that you would talk to them about? Any points that you would make? Oh, and you had mentioned some information about some of the costs to employers. Talk about those too, but give us, as we're sort of wrapping up, give us anything that you would typically do to educate an employer that you haven't talked about so far and that I haven't thought to ask?
I think there's obvious things like employees who abuse drugs and alcohol are 40%, they cause over 40% of the on-job injuries. They're obviously more likely to steal to support their habit, and they're less efficient. They work less, typically 30 to 40% less than non-users. The big thing that really pops out to me is employees who abuse drugs cost employers 300% more in medical costs and benefits. Now, that's something that I never really considered before. But if you think about that, and I try to convey these costs, I'm not a big fan of fear factor in terms of trying to sell my business. A lot of people are like, "Oh, you need my business because this could happen, this could happen." I mean, it's fairly obviously that drugs in your workplace is going to cause problems. So it's really, I don't really like to do that or need to do that. But I mean, in terms of costs and there's price and cost. I mean, cost is a long-term thing. What you pay for something isn't necessarily the cost, but if paying for drug testing is going to reduce your overall cost long term, then that price is much more viable, right? So, I mean, I really talk about setting up a policy, being consistent with it. So I can help set up a policy that's good in the state of Kentucky. Drop in information and you're good to go. Employees sign off on it. That's great. And a lot of people talk about, well, what should my policy be? It really can be anything. You just want to make sure that you're going to be consistent and you're going to treat everyone the same. If you're going to do pre-employment testing, you got to do it with everyone. Because if you do it with one person and not another, then they're going to be like, well, why did I get tested? Same with your randoms. You need to set up that random pool. I can provide a randomization. It helps with that. So I'm just really trying to make it as easy as possible on the employer and stress the fact that here, the facility, it's owned by my wife and I. She basically runs the facility. And when you're calling up, you're talking to an owner, you're talking to someone who cares. You're not talking to a gatekeeper. You're not talking to someone who's there, 9 to 5, and all they do is answer the phones. And you don't have to go through several levels of question, getting put on hold several times to talk about a situation that is causing problems in the workplace. So, that personal touch and that higher level of service is what we can really provide. And that's what I try to emphasize with employers. And, like I said, just be consistent. If you, want to do a 5-panel all the time, do a 5-panel. If you're concerned about this or that, do that. If you want to have testing for reasonable suspicion, we've got training that can help people spot certain things that are obvious in a person who might be abusing type of drug. So just trying to make, like I said, a lot of people are HR, most of them, and they just want their life easier, like we all do, right? So, they have got their time that they're doing other things. So we're just trying to make it easier. We've got a portal that has all the drug. One of our guys loves that. He just put on the portal. Great. I don't need to send a report in the email. I don't need to walk out with anything. He knows that he can look and say, did Joe Smith test? He goes down. Oh, he didn't test. He must have disappeared. So, it's one of those things where he can get his results real quick.
What about rehab? Do many employers support their employees to get rehabilitation, or do they pretty much leave it up to them? If you've got a bad drug test, and then you're out and you're on your own.
Most definitely they're supporting it, especially in this job market right now where a good employee is really as good as gold. They want to hold on to their employees. They want to keep them. They want to support them. There are a lot of programs that bigger companies are having their HR departments where it's part of the process is getting this person help so they can get back into the workplace and be the good worker that they can be. There's through the Commonwealth of Kentucky, there's a good rehabilitation program. And I think drug addiction and alcohol addiction, it's kind of shifting from, it's a problem they have to more of a disease. And that stigma that's attached, which is why a lot of people don't seek rehab because they're ashamed they're ashamed of what they do and what they've been doing to support the habit, and ashamed that it got the better of them when it's seemingly becoming more of a treatable thing and seen that way. And I think employers are seeing the fact that, listen, this person's got a problem. It could be, I mean, I hate to say like a broken leg or something, but it's a problem that we can rehabilitate and fix and get this person back into a good place for the good of the person too. And I think a lot of companies they've got a lot of people that are helping with that, and a lot of companies recognize that. And if they don't, I think that's going to be a problem in the future because a good employee is better than three bad employees. I mean, in terms of efficiency, if you get the right people in place.
Um, isn't it being covered more by health insurance and on the exchange and all that?
Definitely, yeah. That's an aspect where I'm not as knowledgeable in, but it rehabilitation is being covered in certain expenses in certain places by insurance much more, and that's going to help get rid of that stigma. There's people that work with the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and there's a couple women on there who are former users, so they understand how mentally it feels, and they're big on second chances, giving people second chances, and trying to help them through a process and help them get better.
I've heard in quite a few business networking situations, employers say, I can't, I can't find a person that can pass a drug test that I can hire. So it sounds like that's a huge impediment right now to certain people getting employed and certain employers finding employees. Do you hear a lot
That,
about that?
that's a definite hurdle. So when we first opened, I signed several companies that I have not heard from in over a year. I think that's part of it is that I've talked to these people. They're like, I can't find, when I get someone who's good, do I really care that they're smoking pot the night before? Or even, I mean, it's definitely an issue. And I think, the smarter employers are, able to look past the fact that, well, if this person's on methamphetamine, there's a problem. But if there's marijuana, or even if there's any type of drug situation, let's work through it and sit the person down and say, we're not going to hire you now, but if you come back in X amount of time and take another drug test, we will hire you on, and then we'll put you in a program if you agree to that, and then that's a way that they can get people on to get a second chance rather than just, you fail a drug test, it's a no. A lot more flexibility and a lot of policies lately. And that's definitely a problem for sure. I've had several of my companies say, hey, I'm sending 5 people over tomorrow. And then the next day, 1 shows up, 2 show up. There's a lot of different factors that are involved, but it's really just a difficult job market right now. And I've found that employers are starved for people who are willing to do the work.
And when you say there are certain employers that you haven't heard from in a while, do you think it's because they've just relaxed their drug policy and they're not testing people? So that's why you're not hearing from them?
Yes, I think it's some of them didn't have a drug policy to start with, which we recommend. We always want them to have one, but they were kind of like, well, I'm going to drug test, and then they start drug testing and they can't find people. And so then they just kind of disappear through the woodwork. So I think that is a factor for sure.
Mm-hmm. Anything that I haven't asked or you haven't shared that you'd like to before we wrap up?
I just think that there's a wide variety of drug testing that we can factor it in and do something that other places can't really. We talk about urine as the basic type of drug test and things like that, but in terms of a window of detection and what you're looking for in a test, hair is very difficult to adulterate, short of destroying the hair follicle, because they do the hair follicle, and that can show a long-term type of problem. Each half inch of hair corresponds to about a month body hair, and they test 1.5 inches. So they're testing 90 days. So, if you want someone who, the presence of something within the last 90 days and prove that they haven't, that's a great way to go. Body hair and fingernails can go back 6 months, even a year worth of data, just because of how slowly it grows. That's an interesting thing I've thought of. Now, if someone does drugs the night before, it's not going to show up in their hair because it takes a little while to get in there. Then you're going to want to go with a urine test or a saliva test. But we can really customize any type of test people want. Some people with the marijuana situation, some people, we do the test before the test. I had a couple in here that was distraught they had been in Colorado visiting friends 2 weeks ago, and they had smoked some pot. Well, they get back, and the guy gets a job, dream job, loves the job, doing a drug test. What do we do? So they can come here, we can give a test. The levels are pretty regular across the way, but we can also do a low limit of detection level, which is going to go down to a very low level. So it will give you a level, because if you test negative, it's not going to give you a level. If you test positive for a substance, it'll give you a nanograms per milliliter level of what's in your system. We can do a low level. So if someone's concerned about THC, let's do a low level and we'll see how kind of close you are to that point where you might test positive. Luckily, that test came back negative. They were very happy. So, and
they
like I
did
said,
a pre-mandatory test.
A pre-employment. We do quite a bit of that. I've actually done them for tests for people who come in one day and then 2 days later they're in with one of my clients. So, I mean, it's kind of peace of mind to be able to figure that out. And like I said, marijuana is just so difficult because it really depends on your metabolism, how much water you drink, how much you smoked. I mean, this had been a one night thing. So I was fairly confident that I think it was over 2 weeks for them. So, a one-time thing, you'd have to be a real habitual user to have it still show up.
Well, this has been so interesting, and I would imagine that other people would find this too, that if they're just skimming the surface of what you do, um, they're not really understanding the breadth and the depth of it, but it's so involved in so many tentacles.
For sure. I mean, it's as simple as everyone thinks pre-employment drug test. Yeah, I go to the bathroom in a cup, but there's so many other things that we can do. And I've spent hours on the phone with attorneys, family attorneys. I mean, they have clients who can use anything from the drug testing to the alcohol testing to the DNA testing. So that's conversations that I've had where it's funny. I'll talk to an attorney and they're like, "Yeah, we have no use for." Oh, wait a minute, I have a question for you. And then you get into these conversations and, it's some interesting things where sometimes it's kind of like, yeah, I've got to call my lab about that. That's an interesting, and we've come across a lot of things where it is just interesting, but we're always willing to have a conversation with people and help customize the type of testing that's going to work for them and provide the results that they need. We provide results. That's what we do. The one joke I have is one of the cleaning companies that we test, they signed an agreement and they've sent me 4 people. One showed up. So she was like, I'm sorry, and I'm like, well, you're getting results because these people get in their car and they go home. Obviously, they're admitting something. So you're getting results without actually having to pay for results. And I'm fine with that. I've got several companies that sign agreements and they threaten to send someone over. And typically you're going to get, it goes from, no, I never use it. Oh yeah, I do smoke a little pot every once in a while. And this and that. And then, they come in here and they test positive for 3 or 4 different things. So, and I think that's another thing too, is a lot of companies, especially smaller businesses, they're concerned about honesty with their people. It's like, hey, okay. He's like, I don't care if they smoke a little bit of pot, but if they say they only smoke pot, and then they come back with other things, that's one thing. And if they say they never smoke it and they come back positive, well, you're not being honest with me. If you be honest with me, I need, honest employees. So, like I said, we provide results and those results can be different than what you'd think.
So if somebody is in central Kentucky, in the Louisville vicinity, and they want a pre-test or whatever, how can they best reach you?
So we're fastest labs of East Louisville. So fasteslabs.com is the best way. There's a lot of content on our website, and then just choose location of East Louisville. My phone number is 502-901-4560. If it goes to my mobile phone after hours, because we are a 24/7 type situation, I need to be able to answer the phone to provide testing at 2:00 in Evansville or whatever the case may be. Although my region is actually a portion of Louisville. As long as it's not in another franchisee's location, I will travel. I've traveled for testing up in Indiana, down into Southern Kentucky, over to Evansville. I've done Lexington. So I will travel, and as long as it's not another franchisee's territory, it's really, fine. I won't test in someone else's backyard, obviously, but that's the website is the best way to get information, or just call us up with a question, and we can consult and help you get what you need.
So same for employers to find out more and
Correct.
And to get your services. Last thing, I was just thinking, you make these calls in the middle of the night like OBGYNs used to do to deliver babies. I don't think they do that anymore. So you may be one of the only ones getting up in the middle of the night. Maybe a utility worker on an icy night having to go out,
or tow truck drivers type thing like that. I think that's still, and I talk to a lot of those guys because they're at the scenes of the accidents where I have to go. And I've actually gone to the side of I-64 between Hurstbourne and the Waterson. I had to go there to pick up a truck driver whose truck had been totaled and take him to a facility to test him. So yeah, I mean, and on the website too, there's a lot of information. There's a contact form. You can actually make an appointment on the website. So you can put aside a time. Like I said, typically no one's in here longer than 10 or 15 minutes. So we can, if we have to move someone around a little bit, but we can squeeze people in typically.
You probably also know where every Waffle House is in the state of Kentucky to get that.
I do. And I can tell you, I know where a lot of the pilot gas stations are and things like that. I've done collections in a KFC parking lot too. So it's really just, you do what you can do to help out, and you want to honor a person's privacy and yet still provide the service that you need to provide.
Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast. This was really interesting, and I hope so for our audience. And I'll just say a couple things that if you're watching this, you probably found us on YouTube, but please realize that we're on all the podcast stations for those that are just tuning in. You can find out more about Thrive at thrivecolivingcommunities.org. And all of the podcasts are on the website. You can also sign up for podcast notifications. We do them about every other week at this point and have really branched out. So also for those of you who are watching who would like to support the podcast, we're now on Patreon, and we have several different ways that you can support the podcast and our efforts at Thrive. Those will be in the show notes, and we'll also put Mark's contact information in the show notes so that you can reach him. So Mark, thanks again, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. Thanks for joining us for another great episode of the Thrive Co-Living Communities YouTube podcast. To learn more about our mission and how you can support our vision of creating co-living communities worldwide, please visit us at thrivecolivingcommunities.org. To receive advanced viewings of our podcast and other exclusive content, find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Thrive Co-Living Communities. You can also learn more ways to support our mission in the show notes below. Amazon Smile, GoFundMe, Kroger, and our own Thrive Gear store, where you can buy t-shirts, hats, and many other items. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.